I believe in giving credit where credit is due. So before we get into the episode, we are going to name our sponsors. So the sponsors of season 4 are Levo Oil. They were gracious enough to give us a home infuser to be able to make some amazing recipes this season. If you are someone who has been wanting to make infusions at home a little bit easier, definitely check out shop.levooil.com and see if there's something you just have to have in your kitchen. In addition to Temperance Home and Bar. I love Melissa. Melissa has been a true sponsor of our show, working on almost every season with us, and I just love her Botanica. Melissa goes above and beyond to ensure that all of her clients leave super duper happy and are in a better spiritual place than when they came. Please check out the show notes so you can follow her on social media and check out her Etsy page. Let's get into the episode. Hi, you're listening to another episode of Tu Tia Bruja. I'm Bex Carlos, your host. I think it's safe to say that being someone who identifies as being Latino, we hold a lot of titles sometimes, right? A lot of us have a very conflicting relationship with Christianity or Catholicism. There's a very tumultuous history there. I'm trying to work through those traumas. And in that, I think it's important to have discussions. Today, I'm really excited. I have Ramona Martinez, creator of the Visions of Mary deck that is currently on Kickstarter. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Bex, for having me. I really appreciate it.
Before you created your deck that you're working on right now, what was your relationship with Catholicism and Christianity?
Yeah, so I grew up in a household with a Catholic dad from Corpus Christi, and he was very much like, my kids are not going to be raised Catholic. So my sister and I actually grew up in Episcopalian churches, and very much like a lot of Protestant churches in the United States, really pushed Jesus and God the Father more so than Mary. And I actually came into the world of iconography and saint devotion eventually because of the Virgin Mary and her iconography. And like when I started doing visual art seriously about, I guess it was like 4 or 5 years ago now, she was the image that I kept returning to over and over again. And it was sort of like she was knocking on the door of my subconscious. And in pursuing her, like through art making, I sort of kind of fully came into a more reciprocal relationship with the Virgin Mary and other saints and angels.
Do you feel, and maybe this is just me, my family came from the rancho, so there's a lot of, in the way that they are, their traditions and whatnot, like you just see that like this comes from an indigenous people. Like this is not something that they necessarily got from the Spanish. And at least in my experience and like the different things that I work with, I feel like I've been trying to heal a lot of those traumas, but I don't feel like I'm in a place, or haven't been yet, to kind of heal and work with a lot of those European Anglo-Saxon ancestors, because like realistically, we kind of come from a very like militant, destructive people that are the Spanish. You could just see historically, they are a very intense people. I mean, if you disagree with that, for sure, Spanish Inquisition are the two words that come to mind.
I have really noticed that difference you point out between the indigenous parts of Catholicism among like Mexican American families. And I think like what's really cool is that we acknowledge the darker aspects of the faith. Saint Michael is like an amazing protector, but he's also like, you can employ him to like carry out justice in like a more forceful, on the offense way. Even the Virgin Mary, like we think of her as having like a machete, and so there's like more room there to be yourself and not have so much shame, I think, around interacting with those spirits, because that they have, lighter aspects and darker aspects, or more like forceful aspects.
Kind of very fitting and natural that there's all this lore amongst La Virgen de Guadalupe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You had said you haven't gone to Spain, so I went a few years ago, and in the city of Granada, they had a museum to the Spanish Inquisition. It's very uncomfortable. It's disturbing, right? Because you're just kind of presented with the information of like, oh, yeah, we tortured people in the name of Spain, of the Catholic Empire, right? And there's a lot of trauma to heal there. There's a lot of religious trauma. There's a lot of violence. There's a lot of shame. I think that also plays a factor in like why people in Mexico, because like when you have the blood of the oppressed and the oppressor in you, I think that leads to a very conflicting space to be in. I think it leads to a lot of judgment of self for various things that you're not even sure how to connect the dots of like, why do I feel this? Like, is this just me? I did a tarot reading for a fellow Mexican American, and they said this thing to me that like has never escaped me. It sucks because quite frankly, it's true. And it's that very few Mexican Americans, or just Mexicans, period, make it out of life without hating themselves. Like that's very rare. And I think that especially we deal with that because there is all those layers. There is all that nuance to who we are and where we come from. And it's difficult, you know? With that being said, your project on Kickstarter is all about reclaiming Christianity for misfits, radicals, anarchists, and outcasts of all types. So, you know, what does that look like to you, and what overall is your goal with this deck?
Yeah, just really quickly, I wanted to say about like being a Mexican American and existing in that sort of liminal space. And yeah, like as you were talking, I have a picture of Virgin of Guadalupe here, and just like looking at her and thinking about how her like the form that she appeared in to Saint Juan Diego, or Cuauhtémoc was his indigenous name, is like a paradox in itself, because she very much appeared as an indigenous woman with like the middle part of the hair parted down the middle for Aztec virgins and the black sash around her stomach as like an Aztec custom of indicating that she is pregnant. And she is very much like the goddess Tonantzin, but also very much this new Virgin Mary that's from this European tradition. And so like I think when we look at the Virgin of Guadalupe in particular, I personally don't feel a sense of conflict about who she is. Like she seems perfectly whole in her paradoxness. And like I think that it's such a beautiful symbol and so important to like so many Mexican Americans, because her liminality and paradox is what gives her power, you know? I'm a visual artist. I do lino cut printmaking, which is sort of works in the same way as a stamp. You like carve away parts of it with a knife and then ink it, and then you can like reprint it multiple times. And I think too, like the inspiration behind this deck is to really show that the Virgin Mary is like so much more multifaceted and sometimes like paradoxical than we realize. Like she is an incredibly loving and open mother, but she's also like an incredibly fierce protector. And like my personal favorite aspect of her that I think people really overlook is that she's an extremely radical figure. Like the Magnificat prayer that she says in Luke when she goes to visit her cousin Elizabeth, and she like falls to her knees, and she has this incredible prayer where she talks about God, and she says, "He has shown the strength of his arm. He has scattered the proud in the conceit of their hearts. He has struck down the mighty from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty." And it's just like that prayer, and also what she said to Juan Diego, like, no, I'm for the underdog. I fight for the people who society wants to neglect or oppress. And her message is one of justice and having courage in the face of suffering. And yeah, I just like this deck, I hope, will show people that the Virgin Mary is so much more than what she initially can appear to be if we just take her at face value or surface value.
And I just wanted to say the artwork is beautiful. I feel like I'm a cultural Catholic more than like a practicing or active Catholic. All of this symbolism, this art, all of these things, like it's still beautiful. You know what I mean? It's okay, even as someone who's trying to decolonize, to find the beauty in these things. And I think it's important for a lot of us to heal that relationship with Christianity. And a lot of people don't know that issue is there. And the reason that I guess that this is a topic that's so heavy on my mind is that I was always kind of like your father. I was just like, no, Catholicism isn't for me. I feel like I've been gaslit by religion my whole life. As I get older and I look more into my culture and my traditions, and a lot of people were forced to sort of lose their power because of Catholicism, right? And there were some people in the witch community, the Mexican American witch community specifically, that kind of had a whole thing. And one person basically told the other person that their existence as a bruja and a Catholic isn't real, right? Like, in order to be a bruja, you can't be a Catholic. And it's just so hilarious to me and gatekeepy, and also makes me want to like simultaneously apologize for like my way of thinking in the past. It's limiting, it's hypocritical to tell another Mexican American or a Latin American that they have to be this or not that. They have to be this, because I think that for a lot of us, that is our lived experience, right? Our whole lives we've been told, oh, well, you're not enough American enough, or oh, you're not Mexican enough, or oh, and it's been like these hoops and things, like, you know, rings we have to jump through to prove who we are. But I think that what you were saying in La Virgen de Guadalupe, like, we can be both, you know, we are allowed to do both. Brujeria is a Spanish word, right? To deny Catholic brujas and say that, like, oh, they don't exist, is to completely wipe out a history of mysticism and occultism and just people who had to use that as a cover up to practice in plain sight. I'm not going to deny those people because they definitely exist.
Yeah, it's so true. And not to mention, like, I think people will say things like, I just want to like erase all my white ancestors, right? And just like go back to the indigenous part. But like my great grandmother, who was like 100% Mexican, did not pray to Tonantzin. You know, she prayed to the Virgin Mary. And so, like, it's sort of disrespectful, I think, of your ancestors in a way to be like, it's like saying, all of your ancestors did it wrong, you know? And it's sort of, I think, disrespectful to their faith too, because I think at the end of the day, like, regardless of what form spirit comes in, it's all spirit at the end of the day. Like, whether you pray to the Virgin Mary or you pray to like Hecate, like, you're still praying to the Great Mother, you know? And just sort of like in a different form. And it's like, you have to ask the people who are trying to get to 100% indigenous practices, is like, well, are you just doing Aztec? Or like, because there's like way more indigenous groups in Mexico. So it's like, it's not necessarily even that honest.
In order to heal a lot of that hurt that we have to understand that we're always going to have a muddled history, because like you said, like, there were so many, and there still are so many indigenous groups in Mexico. What if the Aztecs were responsible for like dissolving your indigenous nation, you know? Like,
Exactly.
I don't know. There's so much power in just like where your magic comes from, like from your own roots. And I think that for a lot of people, the reason that they appropriate traditions or whatever, is bottom line, they're lazy. They're not doing the work to dig into their lineage. They're not doing the work to try and access what they can access. And I mean, I get it. We are limited because a lot of people, you know, don't have that luxury. And maybe I'm speaking from a privileged place. But I think it's very, when you're just like, oh, and I have to buy sage to cleanse. It's like, is that what your ancestors used to cleanse? Because I know that my ancestors used copal. They do to this day. So it's sort of like, why wouldn't you use something that has that ancestral tie? I just think that that's going to work better for you. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think it's like, it's not just like laziness, but more like shame, like you said earlier, around having mixed or European ancestry and being like, well, I only want to work with my Mexican ancestors. It's like, well, like, unless they were 100% indigenous, which, you know, like my great grandmother was like 100% indigenous, but that like totally is besides the point. It's like, you had the family that you had. There's a mix, for a lot of us, a mix of indigenous and European traditions and African traditions. And it's really challenging because when we talk about whiteness and decolonization, it's really hard to not go to the extreme of like, all whiteness is bad, or like all European influences are bad and should be rooted out. And that's like just as fascistic, just as extreme as like what you're trying to fight against, you know? And we have to remember that our European ancestors sort of were victims too of the racism of white supremacy. And like we can't just write them off like for that reason, if that makes sense. It's kind of a hot take, but yeah.
Not all Europeans are Anglo-Saxon, and not all Europeans were the ones specifically doing the oppressing. A group that comes to mind is the Roma. Outside of Europe, there is one of the largest Roma or Romani communities in Mexico, because a lot of people escaped or, were brought by the diaspora or whatever. However they got there, they're there now. Not to say that the Romani or the Roma were the only people that use tarot, but I would argue that they found different ways to read based on traditions and culture and all of these things. But that was brought to Mexico. Mysticism, period, I think that is very rooted in Mexican culture. Walter Mercado, although not Mexican, I think was such a staple in so many people's house growing up. I think that that's sort of where my love and curiosity about mysticism came from, tarot being part of that. Where did your interest in tarot kind of blossom from?
Yeah, thank you for asking me that. I love Walter Mercado. I did not grow up watching him because I did not grow up. My dad, like I think many Mexican Americans, my generation, did not choose to pass down Spanish. We did not like watch Spanish TV, and we actually grew up overseas for most of my life because of my mom's job. So my dad was really my only connection to the larger spiritual world. And like, I think instilled in me a belief that there was this unseen world of spirits that could like affect, like our lives and intercede in our lives. And so I've always been open to believing in spirit, believing in ghosts, and believing strongly that like any deity or spirit that you appeal to, regardless of your religion, like will have power, like if you have faith in it. So yeah, so I first got into tarot cards my last year of college. I had a roommate who was a card reader, and she had this like really pretty Celtic tarot deck, and I got a copy of it. And then like for the next 10 years, I don't know if anyone else has experienced this, but like when you first start reading tarot, and it's like really important to study, but it's also really important to like put the book down and trust yourself. And I did not do that for like a decade. And so it wasn't until I would say the beginning of quarantine, like the beginning of 2020, I was like, you know what? Like, I've been looking this stuff up for 10 years. I know this now. And all of a sudden, like, it started to click for real. And I decided, like, oh, I'm going to make my own tarot deck. And it was going to be a New Testament tarot deck. And like the idea, like all the major arcana would sort of be figures in the life of Jesus, like going from like before his birth to his like resurrection. And I spent 2020 only making 3 cards, feeling like a total failure, despairing that this was going to go anywhere. And I met someone on Instagram, my partner Chris, who is a tarot reader who dropped out of Catholic seminary. And he and I were talking one day, and he was like, what would you think if we made a Virgin Mary oracle deck together? And I was like, oh my God, that's actually exactly what I'm supposed to be doing with my life. So we started making cards and like starting our Instagram account in March. And unlike a tarot deck, it doesn't have like the traditional structure of the major arcana, minor arcana with all of the archetypes. It's going to be about 40 different cards, all showing different epithets, apparitions, or facets of the Holy Mother. We've done 8 cards of the 40, but because it's handmade and not made like digitally, we have to like front the money for like the linoleum, the printer ink, like all of the tools that go into like the actual creation of the deck. And then of course, anyone who's run a Kickstarter knows that like rewards cost like thousands of dollars just to like fulfill and ship to people. So part of the Kickstarter is to raise money for that and like Kickstarter fees and things like that. But yeah, it's running until November 29th. And like the artwork that you were talking about earlier is featured on a lot of the rewards. So that's basically our project. And we hope to get the deck finished by the end of 2022. So that's the goal.
Which, by the way, don't feel a rush about rushing out that deck, because I think that that is a huge misunderstanding that I would say patrons have about like sponsoring a deck of any sort, you know, on Kickstarter, is they assume that it's going to be a finished product right away. It's like, chill, bro. There have been people who have been waiting years, and it's like you have to give the artist a little room to grow. Like, art is a living, breathing thing. And also, apologies, because for whatever reason, I thought it was a tarot deck, but it's an oracle deck, which I haven't bought an oracle deck yet. So I'm excited because this is going to be my first one.
Aw.
Because I've only bought tarot. I've only been working with tarot. And I love tarot, but I think tarot is also a very daunting thing because it's a huge commitment. It's 78 cards.
Yeah.
You have to read them. And also oracle decks are a little bit more lax in how you read them, because you might find some information on how to read them, but it's really more about connecting with your intuitive spirit and what you think about the situation and how the situation corresponds to the individual you're reading for, because it's a mirror, you know?
Totally. I knew that if I was going to make a tarot deck, I just didn't want it to be a repeat of the Rider-Waite compositions, which I think is like a lot of, you know, there are some beautiful decks that are heavily inspired by Rider-Waite, and absolutely no shade. Like, I have many of those decks and love them. And I personally read Rider-Waite because the symbolism is so great for, you know, readings that are like mundane or like deeper spiritual problems, you know. But yeah, so because I knew that like if I was going to do it, I wanted to make entirely original compositions, and that would have required hiring models. So like if I wanted to do a card with like Mary Magdalene washing Jesus's feet, like I don't want to just steal something off the internet for that kind of thing. Like I would want to hire a model to like maybe get like an extreme close up of like Mary's tears and like her hair and like how it goes across the foot, you know? So like I just have like this really specific vision of what I wanted it to be, and I knew I was going to need like a ton of money and time to do it. And you know, because of that, and because of the huge intellectual challenge of trying to come up with all of the compositions for a tarot deck, it just like I just wasn't making any progress, and I knew that it wasn't this, like it was not this project right now. And as soon as my partner suggested the idea of the Virgin Mary deck, I was like, I've literally been making icons of her since I started doing art seriously, like 3 years ago or whatever. And I think like procrastination is oftentimes a really big sign that we're not for everything, but for some things, it's like you need to like drop it. It's not necessarily what you're meant to be doing.
Thank you for sharing. Real quick though, we refer to it as Rider-Waite Smith around these parts.
Ah, yes.
Pamela Coleman Smith has been a figure who is so important in the occult community, and we don't hear about her enough. And I think that that's, well, one, it's a representation of like the anti-Blackness, not just in society as a whole, but definitely in occultism. So anyway, Pamela Coleman Smith, I get it though. The archetypes are, you know, they're classic and this and that, but sometimes I think they're a little bit too structured. So I'm looking at your page again, I'm looking at all the art, and I just had this like flash of memory, and I was like, oh my god, because you had mentioned the linoleum, I'm like, I used to do this sort of art when I was in high school, and it was something that I always enjoyed because it's, I don't know, there's I'm someone, not that all art isn't like essentially you're working with your hands, but there's something to me about carving the linoleum out, and because you can be very specific in what you want to show. So it's like you can have it be very clean, or if you want like little ridges and texture, and it's something that the medium allows you to do. So what kind of got you into this specific artwork and working with like linoleum and printing in that way instead of, I don't know, painting?
Well, first, I think that painting is like so hard, and I have so much respect for painters. My God. I feel like artists tend to kind of be like working in color and tone or working in line. And some artists can do both, but I'm definitely more of like a drawing, more graphic line kind of person. And so like printmaking lends itself really well to that. And color actually kind of scares me. Like I do color printing sometimes, but even the process of that is quite involved. And there's just something about black and white that I'm like really comfortable with. And so, yeah, so printmaking is something that I got into. I used to work for the State Humanities Council, and we have an old fashioned printing shop attached to it that offered classes. And I took a class on wood engraving, which is like a very old style of relief printmaking that like Albrecht Dürer used to do, like what like was famous for. And like all of the illustrations you see, like that were printed like after the printing press like came along are usually done with this style of printmaking, which is like very, very little knives that you basically like scratch into the end grain of wood. And I loved it so much. It was so weird and old and niche. And I was like, this is amazing. And like you said, like the process of carving is so addictive and cathartic. And you like get into these like, frenzies where you can't stop carving for a couple of hours. But it takes so long. Like wood engraving is such fine detail work. It takes like months to finish a tiny square. And so my friend, who's another amazing artist, suggested that I try linoleum because it's about 250 times faster than wood engraving. And she's like, you're just going to love this so much. And I love it so much. It's so fun. It just like makes the time go by so fast. And I just love, like, um, to me, not only as someone who is like very concerned with what her ancestors think about her at all times, but just like a Gemini who's constantly reflecting on the narrative and story and success of my life, is like, it's very important to me to use my gifts to like help give back to spirit or like help boost the spirits that have helped me. And so I just like feel super happy that like I have something that I can do that I love so much, but that also like allows me to have these conversations about like Christianity and magic and healing like religious trauma and reminding people that like the Virgin Mary is radical as hell and like this whole religion can be for something that is constructive rather than destructive.
I'm just let spirit guide me like in what I record about at this point, because I feel like there was so much pressure that's like, this is what I have to write, or this is what I have to do, or this is what I have to create at this particular time. And when you just let spirit figure it out for you, like, yeah, it causes a lot of issues because I think sometimes it's like all right, it's down to the wire. You have to release this episode on this day. Get to work, and Skippy. Someone had sent me your deck that, that it was in the process of being created. And they're like, oh, and then I was like, oh, wow, there's something about this that's really drawing me to it. And then just like in this conversation, the different things that we've talked about, you can tell that this is something that like you care about and feels very connected to your purpose. That's how I try to live my life all the time. Like, I'm trying to honor spirit. I'm trying to honor myself. I'm trying to create content that's worthwhile. And, it's sort of just when you kind of know what you're trying to do, spirit takes the wheel. If someone wouldn't have been like, hey, check this out, the internet is large, right? We're all kind of just screaming into the void. So maybe eventually I would have found you. But I just feel like it just was so much quicker, you know?
Oh yeah, so so true. And I've loved I listened to your last episode with that hoodoo lady who's just like incredibly wow. Just like some of the things she said, I was like, damn. And then the two episodes you've had with Berto have been like so good, and that episode you both had talking about Virgin of Guadalupe like made me cry. So thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Spirit brought me to you. So this was meant to happen. So, and it's just so funny too, because I for so long didn't talk about like religious stuff just because I was just like, and I know that was my own, like, I was like, I don't want to deal with that part of my healing yet. And so I think I'm starting to work through it. And so, yeah, I kind of feel like the energy of La Virgen de Guadalupe is really trying to be like, you know what, just give me a try. And there was always something about her in particular that Okay, I hate to say this, so, like, I'm sorry, Virgencita, but I found her a little, and I feel like as a child, I was just, like, ignorant, but I always found her a little annoying, and I'm like, "But why are you the Virgin Mary here? Like, what's so special about, like, this Virgin Mary opposed to, the other Virgin Mary?" Like, I just didn't understand. She seemed like a copy of a copy, so in my mind, I'm like, "You're a poser." And I'm like, "That's terrible." But I also see, like, there is a lot of parallels to who I was and the things that I didn't wanna understand or accept about myself. So it's like now Levihan's like, "See, kid, you just, like, didn't like yourself. That's what it was. You did not like me. Like,
Mm.
I'm the rad one." And I'm like, "You're right. You are the rad one."
Oh yeah, that's so funny. Like it makes me think like try to remember what I thought when I first saw her. And I think maybe I saw her first. And so then I was like when I heard about Mary in church, I was like, "Oh, I guess these people are the same." Like it's sort of hard to wrap your mind around, deities and like their various apparitions like as a child. But yeah, that's super funny.
She's making me go through it now because she just keeps making me connect with individuals that is their main sense of connection to spirit or the divine feminine or whatever, a radical and just like matriarchal figure that I feel like you get in being Mexican American. It's just like, yeah, you're connected to these things and these people and these ideas.
I just wanted to say quickly, Pamela Coleman Smith converted to Catholicism and was super into the Virgin Mary. So maybe like since you're into tarot, that could be like an interesting rabbit hole to go down.
That's really fascinating. I didn't know that about her, but that sort of checks out because I feel like a lot of people who find that spirituality or mysticism or whatever, it sort of finds them. It sort of makes sense that she would keep seeking other things that fulfilled her, you know?
Totally.
Yeah. So your practice, like what would you describe it as?
I would say my practice is 90% devotional and 10% ceremonial magic, which is kind of a interesting combination. I feel like for me, I only do spells or magic when people call me with an emergency and say like, we haven't had power for 4 days, or like, I really need protection, like for this. And then I'll do the whole Kabbalistic cross, LBRP, candle magic that is sort of informed by the work of Damien Eccles. But most of the time, what I'm doing is saying a daily rosary and novenas to whatever saint that I'm working with. And I think like my practice has been super heavily informed by teachers and friends that I've made on Instagram, including Michael McQueen at Saintly Tarot Mystic, and of course, like meeting Gabby Daphne La Hechicera on Instagram. She's helped me a lot with, advice that I've had on working with saints. But for the most part, I think like I have my saint team, I have like my ancestor team, and I just try to keep up on making sure that if they fulfill a prayer request that I honor them in some way, whether it's through a donation or like St. Anthony, I've noticed loves public praise. So I like constantly writing about him on my Instagram, and I just got a tattoo of him on my arm. So I think if you have like a good reciprocal relationship with whatever spirits you're working with, they will help you out. And it's been super fun just getting to discover that over and over again whenever I have faith and place my needs in their hands.
Well, thank you again for being here. I feel like this has been a very powerful conversation. I wish you the best of luck with this Oracle deck. Anyone who is listening, who this has resonated with, by all means, log into the show notes. Like, I'm going to have the information for how you can actually support the deck. Other than the Kickstarter, are there any other places where they could send you money if that's something that they want to do? Where can we send them?
So you could definitely pledge to the Kickstarter for no reward. That's an option. And we also have like really pretty rewards for even small donations. Like we made a beautiful prayer card with an original prayer for Our Lady of Sorrows for like $5. I also have a Patreon, and that is patreon.com/Ramona Martinez, RamonaMartinez. And I give background information about every single piece of art that I make on there. And all of the tiers are basically the same. The higher tiers get some goodies in the mail once a year, but that money definitely helps me pay my bills and is like a more sustainable way to support my work. But yeah, our goal is to make on our Kickstarter like $9,999. And as of this recording, we're about 50% of the way there. So it'll be running until November 29th. And I really appreciate it. Oh, yeah. And then you can follow the deck on Instagram at Visions of Mary, Visions, Visions of Mary. Thank you so much, Bex. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing this space with me. And this is going to happen. I have a really good feeling about it.
Yay.
Just keep focusing on creating the art, and we're going to get you there. Thank you again for listening, everyone. Bye. Thank you.